Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fermilab's Family Open House. My name is Holly Cleghorn, and I'll be moderating this event as Wally Lavernier teaches us about the past and present of natural areas restoration at Fermilab. Wally is Fermilab's Senior Natural Resource Specialist and Ecologist. His specialties include prairie and wetland restoration, invasive species management, prescribed burn management, and macroinvertebrate surveys. I work in the Office of Education and Public Engagement at Fermilab. We'll have your cameras and audio turned off, but we'll be watching chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them there. I will present your questions to Wally after his presentation, so be sure to stick around for some discussion. Now, let's explore the past and present of natural areas restoration at Fermilab. Wally?
Thanks, Holly. Hi, everybody. So today, this is what we're going to be covering. We're going to look at the very beginning of, we're actually going to start before the restoration of Fermilab, but I think this is a really important aspect of it. We're going to look at some of the pioneers, or one of the main pioneers of prairie restoration. And then after that, we're going to talk about how the first prairie restorations began at Fermilab. We're going to talk about some of the early management and restoration processes that happen. And then we're going to talk about what we currently do. So this is about all of the restoration at Fermilab, but there is a large emphasis on tallgrass prairie restoration. This is how it historically started, and a lot of effort over the years have been put into this. One of the reasons for this is historically there was 22 million acres of prairie in Illinois, and there's less than 2,500 acres of that remaining. So that's 1/10 of 1% of prairie that hasn't been destroyed, that's pre-settlement. The main person that we're going to discuss here is Dr. Robert Betts. He went by nickname Mr. Prairie. So as a kid, before he even knew about prairie plants, he was grew up in Bridgeport, which is in the south side of Chicago, and he would collect and transplant plants. All of his friends said that they were weeds. He didn't know what they were, so he made up his own names. He didn't have any experts around, but he cared for these plants, and he created his own little native gardens unknowingly. He actually got a PhD in biochemistry, and he taught for 30 years at Northeastern biology and biochemistry. And in July 1959, he took a tour of Santa Fe Prairie, and he met Floyd Swink. If that name sounds familiar, he wrote a lot of, he was a taxonomist for plants, and he's written a lot of plant books for the Chicago region. And Dr. Betts likes to say this is where he caught prairie fever. So he started going on outings with Floyd Swink and Ray Schulenberg, who was with the Morton Arboretum, to learn natives. They would walk railroad prairies and look for remnants. So basically, they knew at this time that remnant prairies, things that hadn't been destroyed, that were pre-settlement, that they occurred along railroads. So this was an area that they would continually walk and look for prairies. So it happens that he was walking a railroad in Will County on August 7th, 1961, and while walking the tracks, he saw a compass plant in a local cemetery. He went to that cemetery and found that it was actually quite diverse, and then no one was managing it, so he was able to manage that area. And that prairie was Vermont Cemetery, which is a very high quality remnant cemetery prairie. So he discovered that cemeteries, settler cemeteries basically, also could have remnant prairies. So from there, he began searching for cemetery prairies. In the next decade, he looked at 824 cemetery prairies. He would map these out, and he would take weekend trips with his family. He had found 44 that had remnant qualities, and these were preserved. He would talk to, find out who the caretaker was, and then convince the caretaker to allow the prairie to grow and then care for it. So he wrote this book, which I'm going to be reading a little bit from it at a couple points, but it's called The Prairie of the Illinois Country. And in the beginning of the book, he says that his children resigned themselves to half hour more of waiting when their father stopped at the family car and headed toward the potential prairie remnant. So his family was well acquainted with him just pulling over in the side of the road and trying to find these rare areas and try to protect those. He would take species lists and compare them to other remnant prairies that he would find. And it was kind of during this time that he would start thinking about, if he was going to restore a prairie, what species would go into it. So all these lists, actually, we have a lot of them in record, and so it's amazing the amount of detail that's in these lists. And like I said, he used these lists to help come up with the species that were going to end up being seeded at Fermilab. So basically, through the dedication and effort of Dr. Betts, it helped save many remnant prairies in the Chicago region. If you travel to remnant prairies, they include some of the ones that you're probably most aware of: Wolf Road Prairie, Hinsdale Prairie, Ginsburg Markham Prairie, Santa Fe Prairie, and there's many others that he helped to save. And it wasn't all directly his work, but he advised a lot of people. Some people from Roads and Grounds historically that worked with him said that he was pretty tenacious when it came to protecting things. So he was very dedicated to preserving what we have. So now I'm going to read a couple paragraphs out of his book, and it's about his meeting with Dr. Wilson. So it's about 3 paragraphs, and it'll take about 2 minutes. So here we go. Floyd Swink and I were on the day's botanical trip to study the relatively rare prairies found on alkaline knolls. As we traveled along the highway to our final destination, we passed within a half a mile of the 7,000-acre Fermi Accelerator Laboratory, being built by the government to study high-energy particle physics. It was in the final stages of completion. Floyd casually mentioned to me that the lab's director, Dr. Robert R. Wilson, had called the Morton Arboretum and discussed the possibility of using some of the laboratory's large area of former farmland for any experimental plantings that the Arboretum might want. I asked the Swink, why do you think they want to do that? Why don't they put it back into prairie that was there before the destruction by early settlers? During the following 2 days, I kept thinking about the possibility of using Fermilab to rebuild the prairie. Since I knew that it was better to start at the top of an administrative ladder and to work one's way down rather than to start at the bottom and work one's way up, I called Fermilab and asked to speak with the director. I told the operator that I would like to talk to Dr. Wilson, but it was referred to his assistant about restoring a large prairie on the open land at Fermilab. He said he would get back to me. The following day, he called saying Dr. Wilson would like to talk with me. The date was set for December 8th, 1972. I asked 2 of my knowledgeable prairie friends, Ray Schulenberg of the Morton Arboretum and David Blenz of the Cook County Forest Preserve District, to accompany me to the meeting, which they did. Dr. Wilson was very interested in our proposal and said it might be possible to build a prairie within the accelerator ring through which the atom particles will be brought to high speeds. Finally, he asked us, how long would it take us to restore such a prairie? I answered that I didn't know, perhaps 5, 10, 20 or more years. I decided to stop at that point while we were still ahead. He was quiet for a few seconds, and then he turned to us and said, if that's the case, I guess we should start this afternoon. So I think it's really important to use his words. It's easy to twist and say what it wasn't, but that's Dr. Betts' account of what happened. So I just want to touch base on Dr. Wilson real briefly. Betts said Wilson was dedicated environmentalist, farsighted, and a man of vision. Was actually forwarded a letter that said that Dr. Wilson laid out the Pine Street entrance to avoid mature oaks. And he also, in that letter, had said that he wanted to approve any trees that were being cutting down on site because he didn't want just to have any old tree cut down. He introduced bison to the lab as a symbol of the prairie heritage of our land and also a symbol of the being on the frontier of physics. And then Dr. Wilson himself said, fantasy of a utopian laboratory clearly required a setting of environmental beauty, architectural grandeur, and cultural splendor. So Fermilab was his vision, and I think that's important to keep in mind when we're looking at what it has become today. So with the approval of the director of the lab, in 1974, volunteers collected seed, and this was all collected within a 50-mile radius. Some of those were cemetery prairies and those preserved prairies. He collected 70 species, and they basically prepared the land, and then they planted 400 pounds of mix in June of 1975 at 9.6 acres. This was the first restoration at Fermilab, and this is now referred to as Betts's Prairie. So here's a few pictures. So you can see that they would till. We don't do some of these practices anymore, but they would till the land to prepare it. Again, so Dr. Betts had the idea and the knowledge in order to restore the prairie. Roads and Grounds really, which is the department that I work in, they really had the mechanical knowledge of how to complete this work. Some of the people were farmers. Some of the people actually just recently retired. So this knowledge base has been carried on. He taught them what he knew about prairies, and they taught to him, how to mechanically restore a large prairie, or at least their ideas of it. So it was a community event. A lot of volunteers working, a lot of roads and ground staff, and then Dr. Betts kind of leading it all. So this is basically how the areas were restored. They had different plots that were planted in different years. So as more prairies were restored, then we were able to actually harvest seed with a combine, which then helped us restore more acres again. So this is inside the main ring. So you'll see that tract 1 is right here. And there's a rock right here. It's called Betts's Rock. And it's a memorial to him. So basically, the whole main ring is about 600 acres. And those were the first areas that were restored. Management during this time mainly consisted of mowing. There was not a lot of chemical weed control. Some views have changed on natural areas management, but mowing was very effective to get a prairie established. Prescribed burns were and still are a critical component of management. In some of the readings, Dr. Betts was actually one of the first ones that came up with prescribed burning in cemetery prairies as a pretty critical portion. So he was on the leading edge of many things as it comes to restoration. At one point, Fermilab had the largest amount of restored prairie in the world. And in my view, it's a good sign that it's not the largest anymore. There's larger tracts of land. That's a good thing. And then during Dr. Betts's 80th birthday, director at the time, Michael Witherell, said hardly anybody other than Bob Wilson has ever left as big of an imprint on Fermilab as Bob Betts. So I think that's important to think about. There's some visionaries as far as prairie restoration are concerned in other areas as well, but we owe a lot to those that really work to get us to where we are today. So currently, I know we're kind of jumping ahead, but there's about 2,600 acres of pretty actively managed natural areas on site. So the whole site is 6,800 acres. There's about 2,000 acres of agriculture, a couple hundred acres of pavement and buildings and things like that. So then there's about another 2,000 acres of natural areas that haven't been brought up to speed yet. So there's plenty of projects down the road. But this is how the current land is. We have prairie, woodlands, savannas, shrublands, grasslands. There's also, if you're interested, we do have a website that we maintain, and it talks about some of our ecological processes. So the current ecology program, we have an ecological land management committee that meets monthly. We have a management plan that's currently good for 3 years. We're actually working on a new plan But it is important to note that right from the beginning, they were meeting regularly to discuss restoration and how to carry it out. I haven't looked through all the notes by any means, but it is interesting to see that Dr. Betts always wanted to incorporate things that he thought might be missing out of the prairie, whether it be Baltimore checker spots or different insect species or different plant species. Like, he was always looking at a way to make a complete prairie. It was, I mean, our prairies here were truly his vision. So it's, yeah, pretty cool. So the Ecological Land Management Committee, they basically set the framework for us to follow. And then when we start getting down to the nitty-gritty, what we do during the growing season, we're outdoors most of the time, and then during the dormant season, we're indoors working on reports and catching up on GIS updates, planning, and reporting. So this is kind of how our year looks. You'll see as we go through summer, there's a lot of invasive species control. We monitor wildlife, plants of concern. We collect seed. We have to plan those seed mixes out. We have prairie harvests, and then we'll spread seed. And then during the winter, there's a lot of brush clearing, and then also plans and reports. I know I kind of skipped over a bunch, but there's a lot of things on this slide. So these are the species. We actually manage more than these species, but this is a look at the species that we manage. And we use the ArcGIS Collector app in order to map and manage the locations of our species. So this is poison hemlock. So this isn't early invasive. It's one of the first things that we'll control in the spring. So all these green dots are spots that we had visited, and then we have applied chemicals to the plants. And then these orange ones are ones that we had stopped, but we probably need to make another visit to. And then red hasn't started yet. So this one was fairly thorough. So we managed 28 species on site. So this map on the right-hand side is for Phragmites, common reed. So we get to about almost 100% of those spots every year. This has been managed by Roads and Grounds for a long time. So I'm going to go through several slides now that show these parentheses, and it'll say RNG, that's Roads and Grounds. FNA is Fermilab Natural Areas. We get some assistance from our GIS specialist. So this is kind of telling us who's helping the ecologists with the work. So we manage 28 species on site. We're always on the watch for new invaders. We know, being especially close to Chicago, things are going to move in and things aren't going to behave appropriately sometimes. So we have to keep an eye out for those things. I went through and added up our data points for 2020. We had 3,241 data points that we had of invasive species that we were attempting to manage. We treated 80% of those in 2020, which is a pretty good number considering it's a fairly small staff. We had two summer students this year, and me, and then 2 part-time assistants. So that's a lot of points for not many people. We also get a lot of help from Roads and Grounds as well. But these points are generally managed just with the ecology, the core ecology group. There's a lot of areas that aren't mapped, or their species, like our common reed map that's here. That's really well mapped out. Roads and Grounds will call us if they see a plant on site, so that we can go out and map it and then treat it right away. But there's species like reed canary grass, for instance. There's a lot of it on site, and we just don't have it all mapped yet. We hopefully will over time. These things, as some of these things come under better control, we'll be able to then spread our efforts out on other species. So this picture in the center here, this is white sweet clover. It tends to have years where it is really abundant, and then years where it's not very abundant. Thankfully, this year we had really low densities of it because we didn't have Fermilab Natural Areas assistance. So we were able to manage that plant pretty well, but it's a biannual plant, so you can hand pull it when it flowers, and then we just try and prevent it from going to seed. And this picture on the left is actually a contractor that was hired by Fermilab Natural Areas, spraying brush and the Eola grasslands, which we're trying to restore for grassland breeding birds. So we collect and spread seed. That's another really critical part. As we take those invasive species out, we need to have something grow in its place. So on a typical year, we collect about 175 native plant species. Again, those are mapped out on our GIS collector app that we can pull up on your phone or an iPad, and then see where those populations are located. And then after we collect the seed, we'll store, process, and create seed mixes to be redistributed throughout our natural areas. This is a core part of expanding our natural areas and also maintaining diversity. So this is what the picture on the left is what it looks like when it goes and is ready to be seeded. And then this is a group from Chicago that is collecting a plant called pussy toes, and it's a short little plant, and there's this old field area is just loaded with it, and so they're collecting that species so that we can take it back to our greenhouse and let it dry out, and then get it back out to different areas. Another thing we do is conduct prescribed burns. So before every burn, we have a prescribed burn meeting, so that typically occurs right after lunch. And then we'll all sit, at least historically, before the current situation where we all can't be in rooms together, we would sit down and talk about the process, the wind direction, safety, where all the equipment is going to be, basically how we're going to carry this burnout safely. Especially being at Fermilab, one of the challenges is that there's a lot of smoke sensitive areas, so we need to be really careful with how we conduct a prescribed burn. You can see over on the far left, these are the current weather conditions. There's actually a weather station that's at Fermilab, so that's really, really beneficial. So then once we have our plan, we'll go out in the field and we will conduct the prescribed burn. So this prairie is actually one from last fall. It is kind of along Kirk Road. It was a pretty good burn. So another thing that we do is we monitor plant and animals. So a lot of Fermilab natural areas, they inventory they conduct rare plant monitoring. And there's, I think Jacques said the other day, there's 4 species with potentially a 5th that we report to Chicago Botanical Garden for the Illinois Rare Plant Monitoring Program. So there's FNA also has bird monitors, bumblebee monitors, dragonfly monitors, reptiles and amphibian monitors. We've conducted small mammal trapping in the past. Illinois Ecological Society has looked at fungus on site. So we track this data. We use Jacques maintains an access database. I should mention. So he's one of the ecological assistants, and he does a ton of work. So he maintains this access database, and so we know what species we've seen and the last time we've seen it and where we've seen it on site. So here's a few pictures from this year. And then we also, as ecologists, Jacques and I and Ryan Franzen, we also take species inventories of each of the natural areas. And we try and conduct them as often as possible. It's difficult with all the other things that we have going on. I stole this slide from Jacques. But this shows when it was last surveyed over here. It shows the size of the area. This is the number of species, and then this is the number of native species. So you can see some of these areas are really diverse. You can see, I mean, 273 native species. Bigwood South is almost 300 native species. And things to keep in mind is as you get to a larger area, a lot of times it's easier to get a higher number of species. And then also the number of different kind of environments you have leads to this as well. So if you have, like Bigwood South, for instance, is a woodland. If you have shadier areas, sunnier areas, higher areas that are dry versus wetter areas, there's a lot more environments for different species to grow in. Each plant likes to grow in different areas. So that's a lot of times, you know, if you see, I mean, something like owl's nest woods is actually a 180 species for a pretty small woodland is pretty impressive. It's also, there's no wet areas in that woodland, so it's pretty dry. Also, we conduct volunteer coordinating with Roads and Grounds and FNA. We have events like the Prairie Harvest and also Arbor Day plantings. We educate, I educate, FNA educates, Roads and Grounds helps with that sometimes. They help train FNA. So there's a lot of education. We want to make sure that we can teach the next generation of ecologists and outdoor enthusiasts and have them being caring for the natural areas. We also, this is more of just the ecology group. As new projects are going in, there's federal regulations that you have to look at the environmental impacts. So we work on that and we take that to the Ecological Land Management Committee and we talk about those impacts. Some things, like if you have an accelerator, it has to be in a very specific location. Other things you can adjust. So we have an ecological sensitivity map, and the engineers and architects are able to look at that and try and reduce ecological impacts on site, which is really important. And then we also manage the National Environmental Research Park. So some of you may have seen Rose Matamala's presentation yesterday on soils at Fermilab. So that is part of the National Environmental Research Park. So as a group, the ecology group does not conduct any research at that level, but we invite others to come on site and conduct that research. So it goes from carbon sequestration and moisture sensitivity, moisture ground readings that Argonne is conducting, to bumblebee surveys, to Illinois Natural History Survey, conducted mosquito surveys over the summer to see, look for mosquito-borne illness, diseases. So it runs the whole gambit. Actually, Fermilab Natural Areas used to be considered a National Environmental Research Project as park project as well, and they've since separated out from that. So one of the interesting things that Fermilab does is right from the start, basically, they started using hemiparasitic plants. So these are plants, they can survive on their own, but they also attach the roots of like big blue stem and Indian grass and switchgrass. And basically they can pull nutrients from them. And hopefully, in theory, then they decrease the dominance of that and allow other things to move in. So we have wood betony in 21 plantings and bastard toadflax in 9 plantings. And it does increase natural patchiness of areas. It does seem to increase diversity of areas. So this is, again, you know, restoration and these things take time. So I would say we're still pretty early on in knowing what kind of diversity we can get out of this and the positive benefit of it. So we're using these basically as we don't have any grazers. We don't have bison on the prairie. So so this is kind of a pseudo grazer, and basically tries to take the competitiveness away from some of the taller grasses. But so far it seems to be a very interesting project, and it seems to be working pretty well. So during this, I also want to talk just a little bit specifically about Fermilab natural areas, because when we're talking about the management of the whole lab, you can see all these activities that we have to do. and we wouldn't get very much done without a lot of help. It also, I should go back and say, Dr. Betts and Dr. Wilson really encouraged community involvement. And so this is one of the ways of having community involvement and staying connected with our neighbors. So Fermilab Natural Areas has stewards. They have wildlife monitors like we discussed earlier. They monitor plants of concern. There's weekly workday events when they're able to volunteer on site. There's annual seed harvests. One of the key things they do is they provide interns. And the reason why I say it's one of the key things they do is because, like I said earlier, we want to train the next generation of ecologists and people that are incredibly dedicated to the outdoors. So by providing interns, we're able to train those people and hopefully get them some experience to be able to pursue a career in ecology. They also obtain grants, and this is also really critical. Like the Yellow Grassland Project is possible through the help of Fermilab Natural Areas. So this is showing the amount of hours they've worked over the past years. I did not include 2020 because they were only on site for the first couple months of the year. So you can see that the high point, there was almost 7,000 hours of help. And it's basically been an increasing program over this year. It's stabilized since say about 2015, 2014, somewhere in there. But that's a lot of assistance and a lot of work that's completed because of Fermilab Natural Areas. And then you can see, so this graph here at the bottom right, if I can find my mouse. So this is stewardship. These are people, the Monday and Wednesday work days, and also people stewarding their woodland. So the stewards, I should go back and mention, they have an area that basically they take ownership of, and they're responsible for the restoration of those areas. And then the seed harvest is a big chunk of time. That's just 2 events. A lot of times there'll be over 300 people that come to help with the seed harvest in the fall. And then monitoring, whether that be wildlife monitoring or plant monitoring, it's also a big chunk. And the education and outreach, and then just miscellaneous things. So yeah, you can see there's a lot of assistance that they give. I should also mention that Fermilab Natural Areas, they work with the Ecological Land Management Committee, and that plan that we create, they follow that plan, and they work with me in order to achieve that plan. So yeah, I guess, it's not like a volunteer comes on site and just runs around. They're working with us and to achieve the same goal. We're working, I guess, in the same direction, you should say. So in 2019, because everything you've seen previously, the origin and all the time and effort that's gone into it, Chicago Wilderness gave excellence in ecological restoration, and we got the platinum level, which is the highest level that you can receive. So everybody that has helped out in the past should be really appreciative. I mean, they should be pretty proud of their accomplishment. And then I have a few just pictures of things throughout the year. So this was actually during a flying squirrel study. So there's peanut butter in this tube, and the coyote is trying to get at that. Picture always cracks me up. And then this is when we create the seed mixes. There was a presentation on it on Thursday. But the volunteers will come in and they actually create those mixes that then will spread into the natural areas. It's a really fun work day, and there's buckets and barrels lined up all throughout the greenhouse each individual is looking for, it's basically you're making a recipe for each area. And then we have a few plants. One of the ladies tresses is a type of orchid, and then prairie lily, which is really uncommon. And then a swallowtail, and I forget which species that is. And then just a few more pictures. So it's a great place. There's been a lot of dedicated people that have come before. I can't say enough about Roads and Grounds. They assist in so many different ways. They conduct a lot of the mechanical mowing. They fecon areas during the winter, so they'll take brushy areas, and there's a specific skidster um, that has a like rotary head on the front of it, and it can actually grind woody material up. And then also the ecologist before me, he was able to justify that this is a full-time position. So this is kind of the next step. Before him, it was always basically Dr. Betts had run the program, and he basically gave his time to the lab, and then Roads and Grounds carried it out with the assistance of several Roads and Grounds people more dedicated, but everybody in Roads and Grounds has helped a ton. And so Brian Campbell was the one that was able to say that we should have an ecologist on site, and that part of that reasoning comes for project review and things of that sort. So it's great to have all these people before me that have really been able to get the natural areas up to speed. And the last picture I wanted to show is, I know I talked about pioneers of restoration, but I want to show you a picture of these people. So Gerald Wilhelm is on the left, and he has also a taxonomist, and they all work together. But he's also a taxonomist, and he wrote the most recent Flora of the Chicago region, which is kind of, if you put it in terms, it's kind of like the Bible of restoration. So this is it right here. It's on our table all the time. It's a huge book. Ray Schulenberg really probably started the first restorations, and he did it mostly by hand. And just a labor of love. And Schulenberg Prairie is that result, and that's at the Morton Arboretum. As I said earlier, Floyd Swink was also a taxonomist. I think Wilhelm and Swink worked really closely together for a long time. Dr. Betts, who we've talked about, and you could say Dr. Betts really started, large scale, scale at the huge landscape level. And then Dick Young, that I know a lot of his efforts were in Kane County, but all of them were responsible for restoring things and protecting things. And we wouldn't be where we're at without them. So anyways, I figured we would leave some time for a little bit of discussion. This is a little bit of a more of a open-ended presentation, I guess. So Holly, you can go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you, Wally, for that great insight into Fermilab's ecology and the history behind it. We have some wonderful questions. So in order to begin the discussion, one of the first questions was, is the Santa Fe Prairie that Dr. Betts saw in 1959 the one in Hodgkins?
I believe so. I mean, it's right on, was it the southwest side of Chicago? I believe that's the one. Yes.
Great. And then also, what is the largest area to burn in one day, and how do you contain the burn site so that it doesn't get out of control?
Okay, so that's a great question. So that I know of, the largest area that was burned at Fermilab was one day they actually were able to conduct a burn in the full main ring, which is about 600 acres. So quite a large prescribed burn. So they had to have the perfect day in order to do that. The right wind conditions, you have to worry about atmospheric lift, so you want to make sure that your smoke rises and then doesn't fall back down. But what I didn't mention is before the prescribed burn, actually in late summer, early fall, Roads and Grounds will go out and mow breaks around the edges of the burn units to make sure that there's a mowed area, and then they let that area green up again, and then they'll remow it. So there's a really nice, about 20 to 30 foot wide mowed strip with very little vegetation in there. That is the border of our prescribed burns. In woodlands, we'll mow around trees, some that are more sensitive. We may leaf blow around trees and woodlands if we want to protect some small trees and shrubs. So there's a lot of thought that goes into this. Also, we really pay attention to wind direction and, like I said, atmospheric conditions, just to make sure that we have the right humidity the right wind direction to make sure that either, you know, for smoke sensitivities, but there's also like in the main ring, for instance, see if I can go back. This is, I guess, probably back at the beginning of the slide. But you don't want to conduct a prescribed burn. This one will work. So if you look at this map, so this is the main ring. You wouldn't want to burn, like if the wind is going from west to east, you wouldn't want to start on the west side. You'd want to start on the east side so then you can burn up against, this is all water all the way around this area. But you'd want to use the land to your advantage. And so by paying attention to wind direction and things like that and planning, you can really make it a lot easier on yourself.
Awesome. And then a follow-up question to that is, how long does a typical prescribed burn last from start to end when you're doing one?
So that depends on a lot. At Fermilab, I would say the typical time frame is 3 to 4 hours. That's because there's so much planning that goes into the preparation of the burn units. Also, there's not a lot of, you know, I say there's a lot of smoke sensitivities, but there's not a lot of really fire sensitive areas. We don't have natural areas next to buildings or things like that for the most part. So that allows us to go a little bit faster. I used to be in consulting before this, and it would be like in homeowner associations areas, and those can be a lot more tedious. And so those prescribed burns, some of those can take 6 or 7 hours. But at Fermilab, we're pretty lucky that we have a lot of natural areas surrounded by natural areas, so it helps.
Just a clarification question.
Yeah.
Is Fermilab still a National Environmental Research Park today?
It is, yes. So there's 7 in the country, I believe, off the top of my head, and we are one of them.
Gotcha. For informational purposes, is there a list of plants growing at Fermilab that the public could view?
So that actually, Holly, you may actually have a better idea than me. I know the education. I know the education center does have a list of plants. Around the education center, there's trees that have tags on them, and there
Right.
was a little guide for that.
Right.
As far as like prairie plants and things like that are concerned, there are public areas that you can go into, but there's not a plant list of species that's readily available at this point, I believe.
That's my understanding as well. We have, you know, the public walkway that has some things labeled and such. And obviously, when people are able to come visit us again, a lot of people who can come out and help as well with identifying certain things that are there.
So the Prairie, so this is for those that may be interested in coming inside, this is the education center right here. So this is the Pine Street entrance that I was talking about. You can see these curves in the road where Dr. Wilson actually said where the road was going to go to avoid oak trees, which is pretty amazing when you think about a director of a lab doing that. But this is the Margaret Pearson trailhead over here, and there's actually mowed trails in these prairies, and they're pretty diverse. There's not a lot of nice, really wood betony patches in there. We also do tend to have a couple wildflower walks during the year when we're able to. So I'm sure that those will resume when we're able. We usually have a spring one, and then a couple of years ago we had a late summer one, which was incredibly well attended. I think there was over 100 people there. So those are things that we can do as a group, and probably getting. So the downside of prairie plants having a list, you can have a list, but you can't really have a location because they do tend to move around a little bit, especially like in their natural environment. So yeah, I was just kind of thinking about how that would work.
Yeah, we do have a Prairie website that shows the plant quadrant reports. And so that kind of shows the historical restoration over time. So that's another, I guess, resource that we have as well from people working on the property. So we have, given the specialized techniques and long-term management needs of prairie restoration, are there any government units at either the federal or state level with a stated mission and dedicated budget for this role? And how much of this responsibility rests with NGOs like the Nature Conservancy Fermilab's example seems to show this is a very localized activity.
So I can talk within, trying to think of how to answer this question. That's a really good question. And so there are policies that encourage it. And, you know, as far as the lab is concerned, the NEPA policy basically tries to make sure you maintain natural areas. There are executive orders and things like that that encourage it. I don't know that anybody's out there, you know, checking on the policies. But yeah, I think a lot of it falls to NGOs like Nature Conservancy and things like that. At the state level, you know, you do have DNR that is basically tasked with that. At the county level, your local forest preserves. At the federal level, you know, that really falls into a completely different group. Fermilab is kind of unique in the fact that it's the Department of Energy project, and in this this is you know, one of the cultural things that they've really decided to pursue. I know that's not exactly an answer, but
it gets us there. So
yeah.
A little more practical purpose, I guess, is do you encounter a lot of ticks in the prairies, and are there any control methods that are used for that?
So ticks, yeah, most of what I've seen at Fermilab are the dog ticks, the bigger ticks, the ones that don't seem to carry as many diseases. So that's good. I've read some articles on, so the best practical thing is insect repellent to keep them off. I've read a lot of or some studies that seem to link habitat quality with tick populations. Like basically the more predators they have, the less ticks there are. So the more intact your ecosystem is. It makes sense, but you know, we have these fragmented areas all throughout, and then we don't have, you know, we have a lot of, you know, hosts for them, but we don't necessarily have a lot of predators for them. So I guess I can throw my opossum plug in. They eat like 5,000 ticks in a growing season. So that's a good management control strategy for us, is to try and have a healthy opossum population on site, but we don't specifically do anything to manage them on site. I would say that prescribed burns probably have an effect on them, but they're pretty resilient little guys. So so yeah, prevention is probably the best thing in having a high quality ecosystem.
Like those long pants, right, and boots.
Yeah, tucked in socks, long pants.
Yeah, and for everyone's information, Jacques just put in the chat a plant or a list of prairie plants. So that was a great resource there. If you're looking for that, there's a link that you can click on and check that out. Also, we have a few more minutes, so if anyone else has any more questions, feel free to put those in chat at this time. And then, how has your management been affected by the COVID crisis? Have you seen a lot of issues popping up because volunteers haven't been able to get on site?
So over a short period of time, say one growing season, it does come back some, but you know, my concern is it's, you know, the longer things go, the more these things are amplified. So right now it's that connection. I miss seeing people on site. Their woodland, especially the stewarded woodlands, aren't progressing. We are definitely losing some. It's not incredibly noticeable, but it'll take time to catch back up to where we should be. So yeah, it does have an effect on things. Also, the one thing that we really did not do this year is we did not collect very much seed. When we look at the number, I think it ended up being over 100 species that we collected, but it was like bits and pieces. It was like, you know, a coffee can here and a coffee can there, whereas usually it's like a barrel of this and a barrel of that. So redistributing that seed into natural areas that need it is something that really fell off this year. And I mean, I don't know offhand, but they collect tens of thousands of dollars worth of seed on site and redistribute it. So it's a really important process.
And someone was asking if the prescribed burns help control with ticks at all?
So I probably, if you're conducting it at the right time, I think it would have some control, but I don't know for sure offhand.
Sure. And this is a question from me. So what is your dream for Fermilab? So if money was absolutely no issue whatsoever, what would your dream be for the property there in terms of ecology work that you're doing there?
So I think they have a better understanding, first of all, of our wildlife communities, better understanding of how to better address those. And I think, you know, if we're really looking at the sky, it's to have as much return to natural areas as possible. Those areas, that 2,000 acres that are currently kind of unmanaged, get those all up to speed. And then right now, you know, agriculture is needed at some levels. It provides some funding to some areas that currently don't have much. But if that wasn't an issue, you know, get all those back into natural areas, provide as much habitat as possible. And also, you know, it allows us to create more diversity, plant-wise and animal-wise, and have more sustainable populations. I think that's probably a simple answer, but it's a lot that goes into that.
Absolutely. People were commenting to give the bison more area to roam. So
that, you know, that would be another thing, was to have bison in on the prairies and see what effect that has on insect populations and plant populations and grassland breeding birds. It's, you know, bison are a move-in disturbance, and so part of what we're doing in those Eola grassland areas is we're trying to create structural diversity in order to better suit grassland nesting birds. They have different needs. So, you know, historically bison did this, and yeah. So
has that ever been considered, Wally, to extend your terrain?
It's definitely been considered, but it's difficult on a lot of different levels. It'd be difficult to say the least. Probably not out of the realm of possibility, but probably not a short-term goal.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm not seeing any new questions at this point, but we really appreciate all of your time. Thanks again, Wally. What a wonderful look into Fermilab's history and current restoration efforts. Thank you everyone so much for joining us this afternoon. As you probably know, Fermilab is currently closed to the public, and I'm sure many of you, as we are eager to come back to Fermilab's ecology for yourself when we're once again open to the public. We hope to see you then. You may know you can also find many more online opportunities to learn about the science of the lab and the programs and educational resources that we offer at www.fnal.gov. And there is one more question, if you don't mind, Wally, that just popped in, so I'd hate to miss it since we have another minute, was just how much influence did the railroads have on the restoration work over the years? So
I can't answer that directly, but I can say that Fermilab has 2 remnant prairies, and those remnant prairies are along the railroad tracks. And so from that perspective, we have about 5 acres of remnants. We have 1,000 acres of prairie, about 5 acres of undisturbed prairie, that, you know, pre-settlement. So those railroads being there actually allowed us to have those prairies. And in those prairies, we collect seed in those areas. We don't introduce seed into those areas, but we collect seed from those areas and move those out into the natural areas. There's some pretty impressive plants in those couple little small areas.
Who would have thought?
Yeah, so we do
those in cemeteries were.
Yeah, railroads and cemeteries. It's 2 unlikely areas, but yeah, that's where we see what we have left.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for everyone joining us today. And we hope to see you out at Fermilab once we reopen. Take care and stay warm. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.